Can you imagine 200,000 soldiers, hundreds of German panzers, and history's greatest gamble being played out before you? McQuarter and his crew had only a motionless tank called Colorado Kid. You can be sure that you will have difficulty believing how this pile of steel changed the fate of the Nazi army at a single crossroads. In the freezing cold of 1944, the fate of the Ardennes hung at a nameless crossroads. While everyone was retreating, why didn't Sergeant McQuarter and his legendary tank, Colorado Kid, budge from their position? Are you ready to hear the chilling story of how one tank turned Hitler's last great gamble upside down? Sometimes the course of history is changed not by massive maps, but by the decision of 4 men in a single tank. On the morning of December 16th, the only obstacle before the Nazi army was just Colorado Kid. Are you ready to discover how this tank, which chose to stay instead of flee, saved Europe? On a cold December day in 1944, in the Belgian countryside, snow was falling silently and mercilessly. Sergeant William McQuarter was huddled inside the cold steel tank, his eyes fixed on the periscope's glass, waiting. His breath turned to vapor. He could no longer feel the tips of his fingers. But that didn't matter. What mattered were the steel monsters that had appeared on the horizon, advancing with heavy steps through dust and noise across the frozen Belgian plain. He counted the steel monsters one by one. 10, 12, 16, and many more were spread across the endless expanse. Thinking that counting was meaningless, he stopped counting. Within every war, there are moments that are never found in history books. Victories bearing the names of great generals, arrows marked on massive maps, thousands of pages of analyses. None of these can describe those moments lost between dusty pages, because those moments consist merely of the decision of 4 men in a tank shivering in the cold, to stay or to flee, to fight or to survive. McQuarter chose to stay, and this decision would change the course of history. On December 16, 1944, Hitler had placed his last great gamble on the table. This great gamble was called Operation Watch on the Rhine, but its essence was much simpler. 200,000 soldiers and 600 tanks, passing through the frozen depths of the Ardennes forest, would shatter the thin American lines, reach Antwerp, and end the war by splitting the Allied armies in two. That was the plan at stake. For the first 3 days, the plan worked. The ambushed Americans retreated in shock. German panzer columns penetrated 50 kilometers into American lines. Divisions were surrounded, roads collapsed. The chain of command broke. The weather was overcast and foggy. Therefore, Allied aircraft couldn't take off and provide support. The Germans advanced so quickly that sometimes American supply personnel couldn't understand what was happening when they heard enemy sounds. The 2nd Panzer Division was the sharpest edge of this mad assault. Having fought in France, Russia, and North Africa, it was one of Europe's most experienced armored forces. The orders they received from headquarters were clear. They had to reach the Meuse River bridges by December 20th. They had only 4 days ahead and 65 kilometers to cover. If they succeeded, 3 Allied army units would be surrounded. When the date showed December 19th, the 2nd Panzer Division was on schedule. Looking from the rear toward the front of the division, tanks, half-tracks, trucks and assault guns stretched in a row for approximately 16 kilometers. Ahead of them, near Foy Notre Dame, was a small crossroads. It was an insignificant place, an ordinary point where 2 dirt roads intersected, A few bare trees reached toward the sky, surrounded by frozen fields. But beyond that point stretched American supply routes, and there, at that ordinary crossroads, McQuarter's tank was stationed. Colorado Kid was the name Sergeant McQuarter gave to his M4 Sherman tank on which he served. This metal shelter from the cold now carried a piece of the warmth of his Denver home on this foreign soil. Since September, they had fought together from Luxembourg to Belgium, from broken roads to muddy valleys. The tank was now more than a weapon to them. It was almost like a home to take shelter in. The crew of Colorado Kid numbered 4. Corporal James Rothwell, 22 years old from Ohio, was a tank gunner. His hands wouldn't tremble even in the cold. He was a calm, focused, reliable soldier. When he began to aim, the world would shrink and narrow, leaving only the target itself in the sight. Private First Class Tony Caserta, 19 years old, from Brooklyn, was an ammunition loader. Due to his fiery personality, he would flare up quickly and roar suddenly. He would speak 100 words per hour, but loaded shells much faster. Did he feel fear? Fear would come later. His hands were always at work. Private Eugene DeLeo, 20 years old, a tank driver from Pennsylvania. He spoke very little. During combat, words weren't really needed anyway. He felt the tank's axis and thought with his hands. And Sergeant William McQuarter. He was 24 years old, had joined the war from Denver, had been given the duty of tank command. He wasn't a great hero. He didn't speak grand words. He just did his job and did it well. That morning, battalion headquarters had given them a simple order. Hold your position as long as possible. Withdraw before being surrounded. McQuarter had positioned Colorado Kid behind a stone wall. The crew first covered the tank with branches they cut, placed spare ammunition within easy reach. They checked their systems. Then they began to wait. Artillery sounds were approaching them from all directions. At 14:30, the first German reconnaissance units began to appear. Sidecar motorcycles were advancing quickly but cautiously. McQuarter began to monitor the situation through the periscope. He climbed down from the tank to check their position, looked toward the crossroads. Nothing was visible. Colorado Kid was well hidden. He got back in the tank. They continued to wait. 15 minutes later, the German column began to arrive. First Panzer IVs, then Panthers were approaching. The half-tracks were full of soldiers. Behind the half-tracks were more Panthers. The column stretched on like this, like a dark river. Something tightened in McQuarter's stomach. He sighed. He turned to his comrades and said in a calm voice, "Are you ready?" "Ready," replied Rothwell. Caserta gave the same answer. DeLeo didn't say anything, but his hands were ready and waiting where they should be. At 730 meters distance, a Panzer IV tank from the advance forces noticed Colorado Kid. It suddenly stopped, turned its turret, and began firing. The fired shells were passing 6 meters away from Colorado Kid. "Fire!" McQuarter gave the order. As soon as he heard the order, Rothwell's finger pressed the trigger. It was impossible to describe that first hour. Words fell short, because that 1-hour time span consisted only of shell sounds, smoke, and ground tremors. But at the same time, a strange clarity had spread over the entire area. This clarity was so pure that the feeling called fear completely disappeared, replaced by a calmness no one could make sense of. Everything was slowing down, but also speeding up at the same time. There was no time to think. You just did what you had to do. Only soldiers fighting in combat could understand this feeling. Rothwell continued to return fire. As a result of the shots made, the Panzer IV's front armor was penetrated. The tank first stood in place, then began to tremble, and finally smoke began rising from all over it. The crew threw themselves outside without realizing what had happened. A second Panzer IV tank began maneuvering to block the road. The frozen ground rendered this maneuver helpless. The huge tank began sliding sideways, eventually got stuck in a ditch, and became unable to get out of the ditch it was stuck in. Meanwhile, Rothwell was placing his second shell through the turret ring. 2 burning tanks had blocked the road. The real danger appeared suddenly. A Panther tank was advancing quickly toward Colorado Kid. With its long barrel, thick armor, and 75mm gun, a Panther tank could penetrate an M4 Sherman from any distance. McQuarter knew this very well, and it was impossible to fight a Panther head-on. But the Panther commander seemed to have underestimated the target in front of him. He thought it was unnecessary to wait for infantry support to break through a defensive line consisting of only 1 tank. That's why he continued to advance directly with full force. McQuarter began to wait in defensive position. The distance between them was gradually closing. 300 meters, 275 meters, 250 meters. Each meter approached meant approaching death. The Panther began firing. The shell struck Colorado Kid's front armor at an angle, bounced off, and passed over the turret. The inside of the tank echoed like a giant bell. DeLeo was shouting, but McQuarter couldn't hear. His ears were ringing. Rothwell's eyes were still on the target. The Panther commander hadn't learned from his first mistake. He gave the order to turn the tank sideways for a better firing angle. This critical order caused the weakest point in the tank's side armor to become visible. Rothwell also took advantage of this weakness, aimed at the target, and began firing. One of the shells fell inward through the Panther's side armor, entered the ammunition depot. The resulting explosion was so violent that the Panther's turret flew 5 meters into the air. This was the 3rd successful destruction. But Colorado Kid had also taken damage. The Panther's close hit had caused the radio connection to be cut, and worse, the connection between the tank and the track was broken. The tank couldn't move. McQuarter looked at his crew to report their situation. "Radio's gone," he said. "Track's gone. We can't move." He continued his sentence. Silence suddenly dominated Colorado Kid. "Military doctrine says we should withdraw." To break the silence, McQuarter continued speaking. "But if they pass through this crossroads, the roads behind us will be opened. In that case, the surrounded units will be left face to face with death." He completed his words. Caserta was inclined to continue speaking and asked the question swelling in his chest without much delay. "So what do we say in this situation?" Rothwell answered the question on behalf of all 3. "We stay." Such decisions made in the middle of combat are difficult to understand. Military doctrine has recorded in writing, clearly and comprehensibly, what must be done in such situations. Every stage written in the records is repeated and deeply engraved in minds through all training and exercises. One of the first rules in military doctrine is that an immobile tank must be abandoned. A crew is worth 10 tanks. Withdrawing is not defeat, it's part of the art of war. But doctrine cannot measure some things. One of the things it couldn't measure was now standing before the crew of Colorado Kid. It couldn't measure the weight in the stomach of a man who knew what would happen behind the column that would pass through that crossroads. It couldn't measure the way four men looked at each other, without a sound, that silent understanding woven by years of combat. It couldn't measure the entrusting of certain lands whose people's names you didn't even know when that moment came. McQuarter wouldn't choose to stay to be a hero. He would stay so that someone else wouldn't die. At 1600, the Germans returned with infantry units. As soon as McQuarter saw the Germans, he directed Caserta and De Leo to the bow machine guns. Rothwell manually turned the turret and targeted the half-tracks. The Germans began taking casualties and withdrew to regroup. Following the infantry's withdrawal, a Panzer IV tank tried to encircle Colorado Kid with high-explosive shells. The stone wall Colorado Kid was hiding behind was shattered. Shrapnel fragments scattered onto Colorado Kid's hull. The inside of the tank filled with deafening noise. But because Colorado Kid's armor was solid, they managed to hold their position. And Rothwell, amidst the noise, managed to find a breath's worth of time and fire shells at the Panzer IV's turret. As a result of the successful shots, the fourth tank destruction had also occurred before them. The German battalion commander was genuinely angered by the sight he saw. A fully equipped, armored division was stuck on a narrow road because of a single American tank. Division headquarters wanted progress. The Führer wanted breakthrough, and that single tank, those four men, were stopping everything. The battalion commander immediately decided and requested 88mm guns from the Flak battalion. They would pulverize Colorado Kid from a distance. The 88mm gun was one of World War II's most terrible weapons. It could penetrate armor from any angle, any distance. It shot down aircraft, destroyed tanks, killed soldiers jumping from trenches. There wasn't much you could do against an 88. McQuarter saw the gun being set up. "Come on," he said to himself, "is that all you've got?" The first salvo fell on the position. One shell razed half the stone wall, the other struck 27 meters behind. The frozen ground flew up into the air, rained down on the tank. The third fell on the turret but didn't explode. This was literally sabotage against German armored units. The shell that targeted the turret was made by the hands of prisoners forced to work in POW camps and weapons factories, and sabotaged by their hands. The action of an unknown person had, at that moment, at that crossroads, saved the lives of four men, but the shell had damaged the gun carriage. Rothwell examined the damage. "Gun carriage is finished. Maybe we can make one more shot. We'll lose it first, then we're all done," he said. They had only one shot left. The weather came to their aid to disperse the prevailing pessimism. The snow that had been falling lightly all day suddenly intensified. Within minutes, visibility dropped to 180 meters. German artillery observers began to lose sight of the target in front of them. The 88mm guns suddenly fell silent. The panzer column's advance stopped. McQuarter looked at his crew. Caserta had a shrapnel wound on his arm. They had bandaged it. De Leo's eyes were darkened with fatigue. Rothwell had placed his hands burned from hot shell casings on his knees. They took a meal break to get away from the moment they were in, even slightly. They opened their K rations. They drank water that was about to freeze. During the meal, Caserta talked about his mother's pasta in Brooklyn. De Leo described his father's farm in Pennsylvania. Rothwell talked about the pond behind the school in Ohio. McQuarter thought of his wife in Denver but couldn't express this aloud. They all knew what they weren't saying, What would happen when the snow stopped? At 1730, the snow stopped. The Germans began coming with 5 Panther tanks. This time, they were acting according to military rules. Spreading across the fields, infantry and artillery units advanced simultaneously. These were the forces coming to overcome a single tank. McQuarter turned to his crew and gave his order. "We have only one shot. Rothwell, you take the center one. We wait until I give the signal." The Panther tanks were advancing. McQuarter brought his hand to the fire button. Suddenly, the sky thundered. But this sound wasn't the gun sound of German tanks. American artillery fire was echoing everywhere. They learned the truth later. An M10 tank destroyer company had been directed to the area based on road traffic, indicating a significant German force in the region. Their forward observers had spotted the German column and called in artillery. The continuous sounds were the sounds of this artillery fire. Artillery shells were coming down on the Panther tanks like the fist of God. One Panther tank took a direct hit. Its turret flew into the air. Another lost its track, rolled to the side. Infantry were running and fleeing in all directions. McQuarter aimed his last remaining shell at the lower hull of the nearest Panther tank. He fired the shell. He had hit the tank directly in the engine. It began to catch fire. Thus, the 5th German tank had also been destroyed. The German assault had also collapsed. 20 minutes later, the sounds of American units began to be heard. The M10 commander got out of his vehicle and approached Colorado Kid. He saw the motionless M4 Sherman tank, the burning German tanks around the crossroads, 4 soldiers. He looked for a long time. Then he began to speak. "How long have you been here?" Sergeant William McQuarter looked at his watch. "We've been here for 5.5 hours. The commander didn't say anything else. He just looked at McQuarter. Then he turned his head sideways, looked long at the burning Panther tanks, the smoking hulls, the destruction traces stretching across the snow-covered fields. As a result of 5.5 hours of resistance, the 2nd German Panzer Division never reached the Meuse River. The delay experienced in the transfer of German reinforcements to that crossroads destroyed their entire schedule. American reinforcement forces flowed into the region with tank destroyers, artillery, and infantry. The assault that had seemed unstoppable 3 days earlier had stopped. The German division's official reports spoke of strong American defense. They mentioned the presence of multiple tank companies, comprehensive defense lines, and coordinated resistance. No official document stated that the real reason for stopping their advance was a disabled American M4 Sherman tank and its 4-man crew. Because this was unacceptable, McQuarter and his crew stayed in a field hospital for 2 days. Intelligence officers came to ask them questions several times and left. They asked the same questions in different ways. "How did you survive?" McQuarter said the same thing every time. "We survived thanks to luck, training, and an unexploded German shell." General George S. Patton pinned medals of achievement on 4 hero soldiers in a frozen field near Bastogne in January 1945. During the ceremony, he leaned toward McQuarter and asked in a low voice, "What was the reason that made you stay there? Why didn't you leave?" McQuarter thought about what answer to give. He prepared a heroic answer in his mind. Duty, country, sacrifice. But you couldn't lie to a man like Patton. "Someone had to hold, General," he said. "We were there, and so we stayed," he added. Patton looked for a while. "Right answer, Sergeant," he finally said. That's always the right answer, he completed his words. Colorado Kid never participated in combat again. The damage it took was far beyond repair. American commanders decided to dismantle the tank into parts. Colorado Kid's engine went to another Sherman. Its transmission was sent to another. The gun was repaired and attached to a spare vehicle. Its hull was separated as scrap, but its photographs circulated hand to hand among American tanker units, in maintenance depots, at command points. It went into history records as the Sherman that stopped a German panzer division. Colorado Kid's crew was assigned to a new tank. They were ready for new missions with Colorado Kid too. In the rest of the Bulge, at the Rhine crossing, in the interior of Germany, they fought together. All four survived. At every moment of danger, they remembered the previous afternoon. That crossroads trained us. If we survived that crossroads, then everything was possible after that, they continued to remind each other. After World War II ended, their paths separated. Sergeant William McQuarter returned to Denver. He started working in construction, got married, had 3 children. He didn't talk much about the war to anyone around him. His wife knew about the medals his husband had won, but didn't know the real story. When his children asked, he would shrug. "I did my duty like everyone else," he would say. Rothwell became a teacher in Ohio. Every year on December the 19th, at exactly noon, he would stop and start thinking. Whatever he was doing at that moment, he would only think of that moment. He would remember the frozen fields, the approaching German Panther tanks, the hot shell casings in their hands. He regretted nothing he had experienced, but he didn't forget either. Caserta and DeLeo lived around New York. They would get together from time to time, drink beer, laugh about who fired which shot. They both agreed on one thing. McQuarter had saved their lives. In 1984, a military historian came across references to the crossroads in captured German documents. In the 2nd Panzer Division's war diary, it said resistance of strong American armor and comprehensive anti-tank defense. The historian conducting the research found William McQuarter. He was 64 years old, living a quiet life in Colorado. He said he wanted to interview him, and McQuarter didn't refuse this request. At the end of the interview, he asked again the question General Patton had asked years ago. "Why didn't you leave?" This time, McQuarter said something different from what he had told General Patton. "If we had left, the Germans would have continued to advance, and further down, at the end of those roads, men whose names I didn't know would have died. Someone had to pay the price. We were there and we said we would pay that price," he answered. He paused for a moment and completed his words with, "There's no other explanation. William McQuarter died in 1991. James Rothwell died in 1998. And Tony Caserta died in 2003. Eugene DeLeo, the last surviving person from the 4-man crew, departed this world in 2006. With them went the first-hand memories of that afternoon. That specific fear, that strange feeling of calmness, and how it felt to accept death and still fire. No one remained to remember, but their story continues to live in the memories of millions of people. That crossroads near Foy Notre Dame and the surrounding farmland, silent roads, fields that turn yellow in autumn, ground that freezes white in winter, as if it had swallowed all the chaos experienced in December 1944. It still stands today with all its tranquility like a giant. There is neither a monument nor a plaque, no sign to commemorate the dozens of memories experienced. The place where Colorado Kid fought its last battle, it just stands, nameless, invalid. The burning German tanks have long since become scrap. The raised stone wall was rebuilt. Life continued to flow. But that December afternoon, at that ordinary crossroads, 4 men showed humanity something. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is being able to stand when you're in terror. Courage is being able to stay in place when everything is screaming, run. Courage is being able to risk paying the price for people whose names you don't know just because you were there. McQuarter didn't know these things. Even if he knew, he wouldn't have said them. He was just doing his job. And that's why he's still remembered. If you liked the extraordinary story of Sergeant William McQuarter, please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel. We want you to be the first to hear about our new videos by turning on notifications and activating the bell button. As we always say, you are all ambassadors of peace to reach our community to the whole world. From which region and country of the world are you following our channel? We're waiting for you in the comments. You too are part of keeping alive the memories experienced in World War II, like the heroes featured in our video. We present our infinite gratitude to you. Stay well.